Hello, good afternoon. It should still be afternoon from wherever you're joining, unless you're joining from Israel, like Nadav Tamir, our executive director of J Street in Israel, who is joining us at 11:30 at night. So welcome. I'm just going to take a moment to continue talking a little bit here while people log in, and then I will get us started. Very happy that you are all joining us for what has been quite an eventful day, eventful weekend, and pretty historic and momentous moment in the history of the State of Israel. So I am Adina Vogel-Ayalon. I am J Street's Chief of Staff, and I will be moderating the conversation, our emergency briefing about Israel's pro-democracy protests and the latest developments coming out of Israel. And the push notifications keep on coming. I'm having a really hard time pulling myself away from the news and all of the developments. And so if things continue to break at 11:30 at night in Israel, we will continue to try to bring that news to you on this briefing. But many of you that have probably been following the news over this past weekend have seen that Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, from the Likud party, stated clearly and publicly that the judicial reform legislation should be halted. He noted the danger to the security of the state of Israel and specifically given the widespread protests in the Israeli defense forces, in the military. Just the next day, yesterday, Netanyahu decided to fire this defense minister, his own minister, Yoav Gallant. And this sent hundreds of thousands of Israelis into the streets at night, through the night, leading into today, into nationwide strikes and protests throughout the country at a level that we have not seen before in terms of the participation of so many different relevant parts of Israeli society. It completely shut down Ben Gurion Airport, universities, schools, hospitals, diplomats left their roles. And just a couple of hours before this call, we heard from Netanyahu, the prime minister, saying that the government does plan to freeze the judicial reform plans until after the Passover Knesset recess, which we will see what happens, and calling for dialogue and negotiations with the opposition parties. He also cut a very concerning deal with his Jewish Power coalition partner, Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and we will talk about that. But most importantly for us here at J Street, and we are so happy that you are joining us because we do all as a movement stand together with the pro-democracy protesters in Israel and those participating in demonstrations here in the United States. And you can see the demonstration that is currently taking place right now in New York City, outside of the consulate, and we will be hearing from Adi Adamit Gorstein from our J Street team in New York, who will tell us about the feelings there on the ground. There are demonstrations that are taking place throughout the country and also throughout the world, organized by Israeli expats and their grassroots movement, Unacceptable. And we are very proud here in the United States to stand alongside them. And we also today, I hope you have all seen, we have just sent out a petition that I encourage all of you to sign. We are calling all of our supporters to stand up with our allies on the ground and here, of course, but specifically on the ground in Israel, the pro-democracy Israeli protesters. So I will start by moderating conversation with Nadav and Jeremy, and then I will turn to Adi, who can give us a report out from the consulate with no consul. And we will be taking some Q&A questions from our viewers. So please do put your questions into the Q&A box. All right. So with this introduction, with Nadav Tamir joining us from Israel, our Israel director on the ground, and also Jeremy Ben-Ami, who is the president and founder, who will be joining us here in DC and talking about how he sees things from this side of the ocean. I'm going to turn first to you, Nadav. Can you tell us more about what you've experienced in the past 48 hours? How did we get to a point in which this entire country has been brought to a halt? Where did you see this momentum coming from?
So this movement was built for quite some time. I mean, every week more and more people are demonstrating. Every week we feel more sectors are joining the demonstrations. So this was built up and building up, and it was exploded when Netanyahu decided to fire Gallant for calling to stop this. And it was pretty spontaneous. I mean, it wasn't anything organized, but as soon as Netanyahu made the decision, people started, I saw it in all kind of WhatsApp groups. Let's go to Kaplan right now. Let's go to demonstrate. We cannot accept it. And it's not that Gallant was so popular in the demonstration movement, but the notion that the defense minister is telling the prime minister we have to stop it because I hear from the brass of the IDF that this is going to tear our military apart and that we have so many external threats, we just can't keep on. And the prime minister ignores it. It seems like too much to handle and too much irresponsibility, and Netanyahu just care about himself and not about the country. So that was kind of something that really drove people to the street in a very spontaneous way. I noticed that there were many more youngsters than in the previous demonstrations, and I don't know if it's because this hour is better for young people, or that these demonstrations that started with older people are now becoming more and more, inclusive. But it was pretty amazing. And they did close the Ayalon, which is a very important highway in Tel Aviv. And this went on all night until Netanyahu came back from London, and things got even more severe when the Istadrut, kind of the union of all unions in Israel, decided to call for general strike, and the whole country was closed, and everybody waited to hear what Netanyahu has to say, and there were a lot of speculations. And as you said, only recently Netanyahu came up and said that he's freezing the legislation, but again, he said it in a way that was not really trying to, to be peaceful to the other side, but actually, and the other thing that happened is that there was a big attempt by Netanyahu and his coalition to get demonstration of their own, and Netanyahu actually waited for his announcement in order to be able to say, I have my own people on the streets, and to show that demonstrations are not only from the side against what he calls the judicial reform. So this is unfolding in front of our eyes, and things are still happening, and it's as dramatic as anything I remember from the history of my country.
Thanks, Nadav. And I was just, before we signed on, I was looking at videos of exactly those demonstrations, those that are the pro-democracy demonstrators that are against these judicial reforms, and those that are in favor of the reforms, and the police standing between them, trying to keep them apart, because there really is this concern for violence, and there have been some cases of violence that have erupted around the country. But this really still, we're still at a moment very much of a critical divide still in the country. Jeremy, can you touch on how this all appears to you here in Washington, D.C.? And what was your feeling as you were watching from here? I know you were, like me, also glued to the news. So tell us how you were feeling as you were watching it all unfold.
Well, first thing is I'm feeling really good just watching the essentially the broadcast from Adi's phone of what's happening in New York, because it's just been so moving that all across the United States, Americans are showing up, and Israelis who live in America, some are Israeli Americans, are showing up and showing support for Israel. That's the thing that is so exciting to me, is this reclaiming of the narrative of what it means to be pro-Israel and to stand up for democracy, to stand up against the ethno-nationalists and the racists and the anti-democrats who are trying to shift the very fundamental nature of Israel. They are not what the Israeli flag is about. They are not what the Declaration of Independence was about. It's not about what all of us envision and hope for Israel. So my feelings have been so positive about the movement that has been generated and the excitement and hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, and all of them, marching for democracy and marching for the principles on which the country is based. And a lot of us had grown a little bit despairing of whether or not the energy could be regenerated within the center of Israeli society to stand up for what the country is. And so many of us have friends and relatives who are, caught up in a bout of depression about where things are headed. But this is proof that if people will get engaged in the process and will take history into their own hands, that things can change. And the Prime Minister of Israel has been forced to put on hold a plan that many just assumed would skate right through this week. And it shows the power of the people, and it's very exciting. This is also just about the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel. And I was in Israel for the 50th. I remember the 25th. These were moments of celebration, these milestone birthdays of what the country has accomplished. But this is a moment of true reckoning for Israel at 75, and to say, what kind of a country is this, and what will the future be? What will the state be like at 100? Where are we headed? And today, Yair Lapid's response to the Prime Minister that we need a constitution. Maybe this is the moment that the country, one of the fatal flaws of the creation of the country was the lack of a constitution. And maybe out of this moment can come a drive where people realize just how vital it is to have a constitution. And when was the last time that you had hundreds of thousands of people rallying in the streets for a constitution? It's a constitutional law professor's dream. But I think this is an exciting, exhilarating moment. It's exceedingly important for the state of Israel, but it's exceedingly important for the Jewish people. It's exceedingly important for the Palestinian people. The country, in order to be a democracy, it's going to have a constitution. But frankly, it's going to have a border. And that's something I was saying to people today, that yes, it's great. If we're starting to really talk about the existential questions we have to face at 75, not only does the country need a constitution, it needs a border. And then the Palestinian people need a state of their own next to it. And that's, these are the kinds of fundamental questions that I think it's been a while since we saw people debating. And so I'm very exhilarated by the moment.
Thanks, Jeremy, for your energy. I want to ask you, Nadav, can you give us a little bit of your analysis about Netanyahu's remarks earlier this evening, your time, this afternoon, our time. And I will not say judicial reform legislation, I will say judicial coup legislation, because someone noted that in the chat not to call it a reform. And that but I want to know, what is the interpretation, what's the analysis of what he said, and can we trust that he is actually going to go into dialogue with the opposition parties in good faith?
I think that to say trust and Netanyahu in the same sentence is pretty much an oxymoron, and everybody recognized that, including his partners. One of the reasons why this coalition is pushing everything so bluntly and fast is because they know that Netanyahu will, as soon as he gets what he wants, which is somehow an out from his legal problems, he will just desert them. So nobody really trusts Netanyahu. And the same goes to the speech that he gave tonight. He was trying to somehow find a way to keep both Yariv Levin and Rotman, who goes to, want to go forward with this, and other people in Likud who feels that maybe, they're losing support of the public because of this. And he finds some face-saving formula, which included, by the way, kind of a bribe to the Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir, who said that if they stop the legislation, he will resign from the government. So Netanyahu gave him something that Ben-Gvir already requested in the coalition agreements, and it was a legislation that actually was introduced in the previous Knesset to create some kind of a national guard. And the idea of this national guard is that Ben-Gvir will have a force in his control, because the police and the police commissioner are saying to Ben-Gvir, we are acting according to the law, not according to what you have to say. The police is acting according to, what the Israeli law is, and not what a politician wants us to do, and use the police to his purposes. So actually, Netanyahu is giving Ben-Gvir this tool that he could use as a militia that will not respect the law. This is very serious. Now, nobody knows if Netanyahu really intends to deliver, just like he did not deliver many times in the past. But if it will happen, it could be very, very serious, another serious breach of Israeli democracy.
Thanks, Nadav. And we can come back to this, because there are loads of questions that we are getting specifically about this deal between Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu. I want to go, Adi, to you there in New York. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Adi. Okay, so I know you're just you can hear all of the background noise. So I want to get a sense from you about the sentiment of the protesters there in New York. How are people there reacting to Netanyahu's statement? Do you feel any change within the rhetoric there? Can you give us a sense of what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, so first I have to say that every time I come to demonstrations, which is great, because I feel people really recognize really the crisis that Israel is in, and want to come for Israel and support the Israeli people for standing for democracy, for standing for equality, and doing what's right. And I think that today there was a good achievement of definitely the process of Israel. The process in Israel. Sorry, people are very excited here.
Can you move a little bit further away? Sorry to pull you away from the crowd, but I want to make sure that we can hear you.
Hi. Hello. That was a very supporting. I think that there was a really good achievement today. That Netanyahu was willing to delay the legislation. I think people are definitely happy about that as well here, but also recognize that this is not the end, and the legislation could definitely continue in the summer. And this process here, and definitely the process in Israel, are not going anywhere. And I think people are willing to proceed and continue and demonstrate for democracy. In Israel, people are yelling here, we want democracy. People here yelling shame, fully recognizing that moment we are in Israel. I will also give a shout out to really the wonderful demonstrators in New York, who also pointed the finger for Kohelet and demonstrated against Kohelet last week, and when talking with a couple, who's one of the leaders of Kohelet, when he spoke in synagogues in New Jersey, in New York, making sure that they don't give a moment of peace for what they've been trying to promote in Israel. So definitely we'll give a shout out to them as well.
Thank you so much, Adi. So I hope that all of the viewers here could hear the energy behind Adi, and it definitely what she was saying in terms of the fact that people are still feeling that same momentum, and despite this freeze until after the Passover recess, people are really looking to continue with that same momentum until they actually see that things are really going to change. it remains to be seen also how things continue to develop in Israel. So on that point, in terms of this continuation of momentum, we saw also just after Netanyahu's remarks that several American Jewish organizations came out to praise and commend Netanyahu for suspending the legislation. How do you feel, Jeremy, about these types of statements? Were they too quick? How do you interpret that?
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that there are moments in history when you're on the right side of history or you're on the wrong side of history, and there isn't a Solomonic compromise, which is the language I think that the prime minister tried to use in his opening comments when he said he was going to delay the legislation. The one side in this debate has put forward a series of proposals that would eliminate the core structures of Israeli democracy. And the other side, the folks in the streets promoting Israel's democracy, are defending democracy. And going to the 50-yard line between those two things and having half a democracy is not a good outcome. And you're either for democracy and for the rule of law and for the protection of minority rights and for the role of the Supreme Court in protecting those who have no other protections, or you're not. And that's really the choice. And you can't go halfway. And so the language that some American Jewish organizations are choosing to say, well, all of this, little tiff over the last couple of weeks, well, thank goodness that's now over. And, we'll sit down and we'll figure out a compromise and everybody will just get along. And this proves the strength of Israel's democracy. No, Israel's democracy is at risk. And as American friends of Israel, you either are standing with the demonstrators and protecting the core of Israel's democracy, or you're not. And to try to pretend this all is just a good faith discussion and there's a little dispute to be had and we should all sit down and get along and compromise, no, you don't compromise over constitutional rights, right? It's a Bill of Rights, it's a constitution, it's a set of laws, and they are absolute for a reason. And, I do find it disturbing that some in our communal organizations are looking for an easy way out. They would prefer that there not have to be an actual up or down decision about what exactly is going to happen. All that Netanyahu has done is kick the can down the road for a few weeks. Let's not have any illusion. I think that's part of what Adi was saying, was that there will be sustained energy behind these demonstrations, both in the United States and in Israel. I'm sure, Nadav, you would vouch for that nobody's going to give up on this when we're back post-Pesach and it's right back on the agenda. And these exact same laws are being pushed forward by Levine and by Rothman and by the rest of them. And, I know a number of questions in the chat are, well, what about the Palestinians and all of this? What about the occupation? What about the conflict? Is it just exciting to Israelis and to those of us who support them to talk about democracy when it affects Israeli Jews? No, absolutely not. I mean, there has to be a direct line drawn for people to understand that the reason why these folks are pursuing the undercutting of the Supreme Court, why they are pursuing the undercutting of protection of minority rights, is because of their racist and ethno-nationalist ideology, part of which is territorial, related to the land that should be a Palestinian state. Part of it is related to the treatment of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so it is a wonderful thing that those themes are beginning to surface in the demonstrations and are being discussed. And I think the riot, the pogrom in Hawara was really a light bulb moment. And so many people began to reference that moment at the demonstrations. And so again, people who didn't want to talk about these issues, Nadav, I'm curious your thoughts, but I think people are starting to talk about these things in new ways. And this whole demonstration is an awakening of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's true that the notion that now we have to reclaim the flag and the national anthem and don't talk about the occupation was kind of the first glue. But I think that now that this kind of liberal camp was awakened and they start to understand that this country was hijacked for too long by the extremists, by the messianic, Jewish supremacists and ultra-Orthodox and corrupted Likudniks. People are starting to think differently, and I'm quite optimistic that this kind of new power that the liberals find out in themselves, because they always thought, okay, we live in Tel Aviv, we enjoy the startup nation, but the ideology is really on the other side. And all of a sudden, they found out that they have power, and I think this power could be translated exactly to what you said, Jeremy, that it's not just a constitution, because a constitution in many ways is a legal border, but we also need a physical border. And people starting to understand that a lot of the problems for Israel democracy came from what's happening in the territories by people who have no rules and treat others, in a discriminating way. I have to say that what really touched me also by seeing the demonstration in New York and in other places is the fact that more and more American Jews and American also non-Jews starting to understand that the way to support Israel is to support the people on the streets and not the government. For too long, people thought that there's only one way to support Israel, and it is to agree with this government. And today I heard that there were some Hungarians and Polish people who are really envious that in Israel there is people on the streets that will not let the government do what the government did in Hungary and Poland. And I think a lot of it is also because of the support that we're getting from Jews all over the world. So I think that as much as we have this awful government, it is a moment of hope when you see this energy in the streets.
So I'm gonna touch on a question first, Nadav, back to you, and then I'm gonna come to you, Jeremy. But there's a bunch of questions here, something that wasn't really reacted to or wasn't noted by Netanyahu in his remarks, or reacted to by Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid in their reaction to Netanyahu's remarks, but it's getting a lot of coverage in press, is specifically this commitment by Netanyahu to essentially make a government decision to create a national guard that will be under the direct authority of Ben Gvir, which is incredibly, incredibly concerning, and incredibly concerning to many of the people who are on this Zoom. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Anything more about the details that you might be aware of, or at least how that's being interpreted and why this is so concerning?
So this National Guard is part of a long list of really extreme demands of coalition partners from Likud in the coalition agreements. The fact that it was delayed until now is there was a decision which is also part of the coalition agreements that first they're moving with this kind of what they call the legal reform, but what is actually need to be called a regime coup. And when Netanyahu decided that maybe he has to freeze, people like Ben Gvir wanted to say, yeah, but we cannot wait because there's other things in the coalition agreements that are waiting for this legal stuff, and one of them was the attempt of Ben Gvir to have his own powers over, at first he really wanted to control the whole border police. And it's important to understand the border police, even though it is partially, part of the police, but whenever it's in the territories, in the occupied territories, the chain of command is by the IDF. And there was a big argument, who will control the border police? Will be the Ministry of Defense or Ben Gvir? And Ben Gvir lost that debate because it was quite clear that the military is not going to let Ben Gvir control what's happening under their chain of command. So now he wanted to have another, kind of militia of his own, and so we don't know enough about the details of how this is going to actually happen, if it's going to happen at all. But it's quite clear that if Ben-Gvir has people under his command, that means that, first of all, the Arabs, but not only the Arabs, even Israeli that he called leftist or anarchist, could be under threat because they're going to use this militia, just like they use militias in many dictatorial regimes. So it is something that we have to make sure doesn't happen, just like many other clauses in the coalition agreements, which are awful and just waiting for this legal stuff to pass because they kept them for the next stage.
Thanks, Nadav. And Jeremy, going back to you, I want to ask you about the most recent comments that we've seen coming out of the United States administration from our government here in the US. We saw also there was, I believe, a quick statement commending Netanyahu for suspending that legislation as well. Can you tell us how you feel about what you felt about the statements coming out of the administration over the past 48 hours. And then I also, just to touch on some of the questions I'm seeing in the Q&A, take it back to sort of our role as J Street here at this moment in time.
So, it's nice to see a quick statement commending Netanyahu for stopping. Where was the quick statement criticizing for starting? Right. That, I think, is a really important question. I think that the United States and this administration needs to be much more full-throated and public in its very clear statements about the values that it expects its closest ally, not only in the Middle East, but perhaps globally, and the largest recipient of its aid. What are the values that it expects that ally to uphold? And I think a much stronger set of statements. I don't think, again, that the White House or folks around the president should be using the concept of compromise. That is not, again, very clearly we're talking about rights. We're not talking about compromising those rights. And I think the protesters in Israel, have made it very clear where they fall. And I think that the right statement for the White House and for the president is that he stands with the protesters. He stands with those who are fighting for their democratic values. And, to say that it is not something, that our commitment to security may be ironclad, but their commitment to democracy needs to be ironclad. And I'll give one example. As I understand it, Adina, there is a 3-day White House summit that is related to democracy and democratic values, a global summit. It's being done virtually. But in what really, if you looked under the dictionary, under irony, apparently the Prime Minister of Israel is slated to speak on a panel about democratic values. I think that the White House should make a public declaration that the people who speak at a democratic values summit need to be 100% committed to democratic values. And there should be a price for admission to the Democratic Values Summit. And I don't really quite understand how in this moment a platform like that could be being offered to the Prime Minister of Israel, given what has been allowed to happen on his watch and the things that he encouraged by forming this government and inviting these people into positions of power in the first place. So I think there's a lot more that this administration and this country need to be doing. We think members of Congress need to be speaking out more vocally as well. And the international pressure is part of the package that is helping to stop this and perhaps to move things in a better direction. I saw in the Q&A some questions about the tech sector, been very important. The labor movement, which, by the way, is Likud controlled, came out with the call for the general strike today. And so you see all parts of Israeli society building the pressure to stop this, and international pressure, American pressure from the Congress, from the White House, and from the Biden administration is absolutely essential to that.
Thanks, Jeremy. Nadav, I want to go back to you and speculate a little bit about the viability of this government. Seeing Yoav Gallant come out after initially saying that he was going to make a statement, and then going and meeting with Netanyahu, and then retracting his public statement, and then coming out with a public statement, and a lot of murmurings around about different members of Knesset, other ministers in Likud, and their discomfort with how the government is continuing to move forward on this. Of course, there are also several members of the coalition that are very upset with Netanyahu's decision to suspend this legislation until after the Passover recess. And I also saw some polls that were coming out today where Likud was plummeting down to 25 mandates, potentially. What do you think this means for the stability of the government? Do you see a crack here? Do you think that the commitments that Netanyahu has made to his far-right coalition partners are enough? What's happening inside the Likud? Can you give our viewers a sense of those internal political dynamics?
Yeah, I think that this government is really shaking now. I think that those polls that you mentioned and previous polls that were not about how many mandates in elections, but if the people support this regime coup or not, shows that many Likudniks are not happy. They see how the ultra-Orthodox and the Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are actually taking their party, who's supposed to be the biggest party, and Netanyahu is just a tool for those other parties. And I think that now that they're starting to see that the polls are down, that the public is not with them, that the major sectors in Israel, you mentioned the high tech, the banking, the labor, the academia, the military, the police are on the other side. People are starting to feel that Netanyahu is not this magician that gave them victory after victory, and maybe Netanyahu is starting to become a liability rather than an asset. So I actually feel that we will see more and more members of Likud that are starting to think that maybe their future is different. It very much reminds me of what we saw in the Republican Party, that for a long time people were unhappy about Trump, but that they were afraid of their constituencies, so they didn't speak. But after the midterm elections, when the red wave didn't really happen, all of a sudden you're starting to see people speaking against Trump, and DeSantis becoming a hero. So I think it's going to happen also in Likud, and Netanyahu is trying to find a formula to make everybody happy and keep this coalition, but I don't think it will hold for too long.
Thanks, Nadav. I want to take a moment also just to thank the incredible showing of our viewers. We have over 800 people now on this Zoom, and I want to encourage, I know that we've put into the chat information about the petition to continue to stand with the Israeli pro-democracy protesters. So please do feel free to circulate that petition throughout your networks, and really encourage people to stand with all of these. Yes, thank you again, is the link in the chat. Encourage all of your networks and people that share your values, our values of justice and freedom and democracy. Please do sign that petition. I want to also go back now just to some of the questions that we're seeing. There's a lot of questions in the chat, but one question that caught my eye, because it happens to touch on some of my own personal anxieties, is we do know that the situation right now is quite volatile, right? That was one of the things that Yoav Gallant came out and said in his statement, is that the security of the state of Israel is really fragile at this moment. And we have seen in previous Netanyahu governments the ability to distract us when there is a possibility of a threat or outbreak of violence. I'm curious to know, are there other people, Nadav, that you here are talking about on the ground about this potential threat or additional threats? I know already the situation was volatile on the ground in the West Bank with the decline in security coordination, between the PA and the Palestinian Authority and Israeli security forces. Of course, there's always, a feeling that that there's a potential threat coming from Islamic Jihad or Hamas in Gaza. Is there a sense that there could be something happening that could potentially distract the public from the state of affairs around the judicial pieces of legislation?
Yeah, it's very hard to predict those things, but there are a lot of people in the security echelon that are really concerned. Today we had a press conference of the commanders for Israel security, former IDF, Shabak, Mossad, police, and now also diplomats, who spoke about the fact that this government is causing those rifts while we have so many, outside threats. And you also hear Nasrallah speaking about how he's enjoying to see the Israeli society collapsing. We hear also this kind of noises from Iran, and everybody are concerned about Ramadan and what happened when Ramadan and Passover are at the same time, and religious fanatics gonna use the holidays in a very disturbing way. The question, of course, is will Netanyahu try to kind of use something like that to distract? And this is not his nature, at least not in the past. He was usually, kind of conservative about those issues. But as I said, it's not the same Netanyahu anymore. He is so in the hands of Ben-Gvir, who's a provocateur who, went to the Temple Mount Haram el-Sharif in the first week of his term. So things could happen, and the very extreme people in this coalition who also spoke about wiping up Hawara, they could make things really, hurt the stability in the region. I don't think it is what Netanyahu wants, because he is trying to present himself as Mr. Security, who know how to handle the situation. But with this kind of coalition, anything can happen. And of course, there are spoilers in the region who would love to use this situation. So between those who use security always to kind of say we don't have to deal with anything else, and those who might kind of inflame things because of their provocations, we're trying to find the middle ground. And I think that one of the things that are very concerning to Gallant, and this is why he spoke, is the fact that so many reservists and pilots and others are saying, we are not going to volunteer or to serve if it's a dictatorship and if it's not a democracy. We signed up to serve this country and are willing to die for this country, but only if it's a democracy. So we're in this kind of shaky situation, but I actually think that sometimes we need this kind of to get out of our balance in order to make things better. Today is the day that we're celebrating 44 years of the peace with Egypt. And the peace of Egypt came after a big trauma of the Yom Kippur War. I do hope that we are not going to see another war, but I do think that this constitutional crisis might be a moment of awakening for Israelis to understand that something needs to change.
Thanks, Nadav. So I'm going to try to blend together a couple of questions or a bunch of questions that I've been seeing in the Q&A. Jeremy, you talked about how we have differentiated ourselves from other organizations, other American Jewish organizations that have been outspoken during this time in different ways. So one, I would just like for you to touch on how you see this as a moment, as an opportunity also for our movement here in the United States, being that I think we have always said very, very strongly, you can be very clearly pro-Israel and also highly critical of the Israeli government, and those things are not mutually exclusive. So one thing that I would like you to touch on, and then I would also like for you to touch on the connection, of course, between this moment and the issue that is so important to us, which is the advancement of a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and how the Palestinians fit in to the bigger picture of what we are talking about here in terms of the struggle for Israeli democracy, of course, within the Green Line, but of course, it extends over the Green Line. So two different topics that I would like to pose to you. One is the moment for us as J Street here, and how we are talking about this and the role of this moment in incorporating the issue that is so important to us with advancing a resolution to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians.
So I do want to take a second to note that the camera that Adi is carrying is focused in on another one of our staff people, Shani, who is one of the leaders of the Unacceptable movement in New York. And she's the person jumping up and down with the megaphone. And I'm just very excited to see her right in the center of everything, shouting out orders to everybody about what they need to be doing and leading the chants and all. So that's part of what J Street is doing, is supporting Shani in this important work. So this is an incredibly important moment for the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I think it has been a moment of awakening for people who care about Israel from the traditional stance that many have held, that the only way that we can be pro-Israel is to be silently supportive of whatever it is that's going on in Israel. And I think the thing that shook up the Jewish world a little bit and the pro-Israel world a little bit about J Street when we started it now 15 years ago was this notion that we said you can be pro-Israel and you can criticize what's going on over there. And in fact, it's possibly the single most pro-Israel thing you can do is to stand up and say some of these things need to change if Israel is going to be secure and democratic and at peace with its neighbors. And I think that really rocked some people's boats for a while. And they said, no, we really can't. We're not allowed to. We live here. They live there. They send their kids. They pay taxes. We live here. But this crisis has led to a whole series of people who traditionally said, don't speak up, don't say anything, suddenly speaking up and saying something. And a lot of people in Israel begging, essentially, Americans to stand up and be heard, to say, please help us in this moment, stand with us in this moment, speak out. And so I think for J Street, this is a very seminal moment, that it's very hard to go back now to a mindset where, okay, never mind, it's never okay to say anything critical about what's going on in Israel, and it's not okay for us to speak our minds. I think that cat is out of the bag. You know, I think that we're now getting used to exercising that muscle of speaking out and saying what we think about what's going on over there. And that's really, really healthy. There's a wide range of views in this country about what is going on over there, and they're all important and they're all legitimate. And it's really important that those of us who are pro-Israel, but critical of whether it is anti-democratic moves or it is the occupation, we have every right and an obligation to be engaged, as all these folks are today, right outside the Israeli consulate and all over the country on this debate. So I think this is a very important moment. A lot of people are taking a second look at J Street and are deciding whether or not they would be comfortable at J Street as a political home, because other organizations that have been around for 50, 60, 70 or more years that say, let's just be quiet and let them figure it out. And meanwhile, you know, continue to say we want to work with the insurrectionists in this country and endorse them and fund them. You know, that is not a pro-Israel stance that's going to be very comfortable for the majority of Jewish Americans. And J Street can be that home. And I think this is a real opportunity. We've seen tremendous growth in our numbers of supporters. We've seen hundreds and thousands of people joining our lists and signing our petitions and contributing to the organization. I think that this is a very important moment for J Street, and I'd urge people to sign our petitions, pass them along to friends and relatives, spread the word. We've put a couple of links into the chat. for today's petition of solidarity with the demonstrators, but also a petition to the White House to do more to stand up to Netanyahu's agenda. So that is sort of the first part of your question about J Street. But I'd say the other thing, and maybe this is a way that for my part of the program to sort of close it out, there is a moment of choice that we said was always going to have to come for the state of Israel. And it's not between being Jewish and democratic. That's something that a lot of people have a fun time debating. There are actually three things on the table. And we've said this since the beginning of J Street, and it's a very common framework. And I just want to reiterate it. The choice that Israel has to make is among three things: controlling all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, being a democracy, or having a Jewish character. And it can only have two of those three things. And the agenda of the far right that controls this government, that Netanyahu has enabled and brought in and given the keys to the kingdom, their agenda is to ensure that Israel controls all the land and that only the Jewish people have sovereignty, which is the first line in their coalition. I am not saying anything that they are not saying publicly. First line in the coalition agreement: exclusive Jewish sovereignty between the river and the sea. And that means you can't be a democracy. So they've made their choice. But for those of us who want Israel to have a Jewish character and to be a democracy, and by democracy we mean not just the ability to vote, but the respect of everybody's equal rights, the only way that can happen is if you don't control all the land. There has to be territorial compromise. And that moment of choice, that moment of reckoning, we've said for 15 years, Israel will reach that moment when it has to make that choice. And it may well be that we are now at that moment, that this is part of that moment, and wrapping in that question of land and territory and sovereignty and control to the discussion about Jewish versus democratic nature of the state is so critical. It isn't just the two things that one has to choose among. It is actually three things. And if there is a Palestinian state, and if there is a state of the Jewish people, the state of the Jewish people can be a democracy and have a Jewish nature, as long as it is providing full and equal rights to all its citizens, regardless of their background. And that's got to be the outcome. That's the North Star we're keeping our eye on through all of this. And I think that this is that moment of choice, Adina. I think we've reached that moment. And that's why the pro-democracy movement has to include Palestinian rights. It has to include territory. It has to include discussion of what it means to hold 5 million people under military occupation without granting them rights, because that's not a democracy either. And getting that into the conversation and the rhetoric is a really important role of J Street in this moment.
Thanks, Jeremy. I also just, you touched on a bunch of details relating to the coalition agreements, and there is a question also about where we can find information about coalition agreements. So I just want to make sure that all of you have seen a resource that our policy center has put together, which is a dossier which we are tracking. We have been tracking since the formation of this government, all of the details. It is quite a long document that includes all of the details and developments, and we update it regularly with additional developments as they happen. And includes information about what can be found in the coalition agreements, and there's also pieces of legislation that have advanced alongside the pieces of legislation that have been moving forward up until this point with the judicial reform package, as it is called by this government. I want to thank everyone who took the time this afternoon to be with us. I want to thank you, Nadav, specifically for being here. It's 12:30 at night. There's still things happening on the streets in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and I appreciate you being here with us and awake and giving us your analysis of everything that's happening. And thank you, of course, to Adi for being there in New York in front of the Israeli consulate in New York, and Jeremy, of course, and of course, Shani Granot, who is really one of the driving forces behind all of the demonstrations that have been taking place in New York. And Jeremy, of course, thank you to you also for your analysis and giving a roadmap, I would say, for our movement here into the types of things that we can be doing here from the United States, both to call on our elected representatives to speak out, to stand with the Israeli pro-democracy movement, also in the administration, and all of us, giving us a place to be active and to stand alongside one another and to be in a community that really puts our values into action. So we will continue to do that. We will continue to pray with our feet, as the great have said, and we will see you back here for another J Stream. So thank you all, and have a good night and evening and afternoon.
Thanks, Adina.